Just making a quick video talking about voltage reduction technology. So, you might say to yourself, well, what the heck is that? Well, if you want to be able to run certain appliances that draw a lot of AC power, such as this kettle, this water kettle here, water heater, you might want to do that if you're out camping. And of course, all of this applies to an emergency situation as well, if your power is out. You might want to be able to do stuff like that, heat up water, heat up food, cook food, with a small power station, right? I mean, of course you can do that with a large power station like this Delta 2. This thing's got an 1800 watt inverter. You can do almost anything with this thing. But, it's very big. It's very big, it's very heavy. Well, actually, it's not, but it's a lot, hey, it's a lot bigger than a small power station. Like this thing is only 400 watt hours, and it's got a 400 watt inverter, and it's like 8 pounds. So actually, it's about a third of the size and weight of the Delta 2, and that's appealing for a lot of reasons, isn't it? Especially if you're out on an adventure somewhere, or just, for price reasons as well, right? I mean, a smaller power station with a smaller battery, smaller inverter is going to be a lot cheaper. So, but you might still want to be able to do, do stuff like this. So, we're going to actually talk about how to use this feature, how to use it right. Because, when you're talking about voltage reduction, a lot of appliances, they need to have the proper voltage, which is about 120 volts. 110 volts will work fine as well. 110 to 120 volts. A lot of appliances need to have that exact voltage, like a microwave. You can't, you can't use this voltage reduction technology with a microwave. You will damage it, right? The same thing with like a full-size fridge, an air conditioning unit. Those types of appliances, they don't actually draw a lot of continuous power, but the surge is huge on them. And you'll never be able to do that, handle that huge surge with a small power station. And that surge has to be at the proper voltage. You can't, you can't have the voltage drop on you. So yeah, no full-size fridges, no air conditioning units, no like large air compressors, and again, yeah, no microwaves. Those are very voltage sensitive. But if you have the right appliance, like this kettle is perfect for this video, in fact, because this is the ideal appliance that you want to use. So, in order to heat up the water, there's a little coil in the bottom, a resistive coil, basically, that, it just gets hot, and it doesn't care what the voltage is, really. It doesn't care. It's just going to draw a certain number of amps, and as long as the power station can provide those amps, it's going to work fine. It doesn't care what the voltage is. And so basically what will happen here is, since volts times amps gives you watts, what will happen is the power station will actually go up to its maximum output, continuous watts, and it'll maintain the number of amps that the appliance is drawing, that it requires. And so if you do the math, basically something will have to drop, right? And that's the voltage. The voltage will drop so that you have, the power station is able to output whatever the inverter can output, and the appliance will be satisfied with the number of amps it wants, but as a result, the voltage will have to drop. So we'll do the math, when I actually plug this in, we'll do the math and show you exactly what, what kind of numbers we're talking about. Let's go ahead and fire this thing up with the Delta 2. So this thing, again, has an 1800 watt inverter, and it can power this kettle no problem at full voltage. And this kettle is rated for 870 watts at 120 volts. So yeah, let's just turn it on and, you know, let's just see what the Delta 2 actually says. So 825 watts. And the Delta 2 does output the full 120 volts. So yeah, 820 now. It's going to drop a little bit as it heats up. So somewhere just north of 800 watts is kind of the baseline for this at full voltage. Now, as I mentioned, this little power station here only has a 400 watt inverter. Now that is, you know, it is underrated slightly. I think from what I've seen, it can actually do 450 continuous. But, you know, you get the idea. It's way, it's way below 800 and some watts, right? It would never be able to power this kettle, you know, at full voltage. Alright, so I've gone ahead and plugged it in. I've plugged in the kettle to this little power station, and, you know, let's just, hey, you know, let's just turn it on, and yeah, let's just see what happens. So I'll have the screen going here, turn that on, and you can see it jumps up to about 460 watts. That's about the maximum that this thing can do, like continuous watts. And of course it knows that, so it's detected that it can't power this kettle at the full voltage. So it's detected that, and it's basically gone to its maximum that it can output. And basically, you know, if we do the math, what you'll see is that this kettle, you know, it wants to draw about 7 amps, doesn't it? Somewhere around there, you know, because as we saw with the Delta 2, it was pulling a little over 800 watts at 120 volts. So yeah, somewhere around 7 amps is what it wants to pull. And this power station is actually providing it. As you can see, it's still continuing to power it at its maximum output of apparently 466 watts. And yeah, you know, it's heating up the water. You can actually hear it. Yeah, you can actually hear it starting to heat up. Now, of course, it's going to be slower, right? It is going to be slower to kind of get this water to boil than if you had the full power, the full voltage. But it is working. And that's the key thing, right? If you want to be able to heat up water, boil water out on the go with a small power station, this feature, voltage reduction technology, you know, it will do it. Now, there's things you need to note about this, because there are some appliances that you might think are perfect, you know, that just have a resistive heater, and, you know, it could still be something that causes you a problem. And by the way, one thing to note too with this appliance being the perfect appliance is there's just this physical switch. There's no electronic display. You know, if I pop this, that's it. You know, that's basically, that switch is on if it's down, and it's off if it's up, right? So there's no electronic display, because there are a lot of resistive appliances that do have an electronic display. And while the resistive heater element doesn't care about the voltage, that display might care. You know, it might care, especially if you're way down. You know, if you're really kind of pushing the limits here, you know, with something that's only outputting like 60, 65 volts, like we are in this video. You know, you might run into an issue, right, where that voltage, you know, the display might not like that low voltage. So the one thing I would say is try to find an appliance, a kettle, if it's a hot plate, you know, to cook with. These are the most common things you want to use. You know, try to find something that just has that physical switch and no fancy electronic display. Find an appliance that's super cheap. You know, like go to Walmart and buy the cheapest one, just in case, you do have an issue, you know, just in case you do break it, right? Because that's always a possibility when you're using such low voltage. Now, again, this appliance here, just being a mechanical switch and nothing else, it's not going to be a problem at all. It's just, you know, if you got any kind of electronic component, you're running the risk of that. And then the same thing applies to another thing you might want to use, you know, this feature for is like a hair dryer, right? You might want to use a hair dryer, and a hair dryer, the heating element again is just a resistive load. So you might say, well, that's fine, and they almost always just have a mechanical switch on them as well. But the thing is, a hair dryer also has a fan, doesn't it? It has a little fan motor. So, you know, that could be a point of concern there as well, because typically motors don't like low voltage. So, you know, again though, go to Walmart, buy the cheapest one, right? Buy the cheapest hairdryer you can find that has one of those low speed settings or low heat settings, because you're going to need that as well. You know, you're going to need, yeah, so let's actually talk about that, because there are limitations to this feature. Typically, from what I've seen, a power station will only let you drop the voltage by half, okay? So this kettle actually being around 800 watts and this power station being able to output around 400 watts, very close, isn't it? It's very close to half. So, you know, if you were to, let's just say this kettle drew 1200 watts, right? Or you had a 1200 watt hot plate, you know, you're not going to be able to do it or use a power station with like a 400 watt inverter, because that's less than half. That's like a third. You know, and the voltage would have to be like 40 volts. So typically what we've seen is that the power stations with these features, with this voltage reduction technology, will actually limit it to half the voltage, or somewhere around 60 volts, right? Because the normal is 120, maybe the normal is 110, 55 to 60 volts. They typically cut you off at that point. You know, you're not going to be powering things at like 20, 30, 40 volts AC. And it would be silly anyways, because it would be so slow. It would take so long, right? So you want to pair up your power station. You know, again, if it's a 300 watt inverter, which is a very common size for small power stations, and it has this voltage reduction technology feature, you know, that would be 600 watts that it could do, right? A 600 watt appliance. So even that probably wouldn't be able to power this 800 watt kettle. And one thing you want to note here too, this is very important. You know, a lot of these power stations have multiple outlets. Like this Bluetti has 2 of them. You know, some of them have more than that. Some of them have 3 or 4. So it's going to be, every outlet is going to be affected by this voltage dropping feature. So every outlet, the voltage is going to drop. So this is very important to understand, because if you plug in something that maybe is the perfect appliance, you know, maybe it is just a kettle or a hot plate or something, and it's appropriate for this feature, but guess what? You've also got like a computer, you know, plugged into the other outlet. Well, the voltage is going to drop on that as well, right? And a computer will be damaged for sure by low voltage. You know, any kind of electronic device, a TV, even just like a little internet router, modem, right? So you got to unplug those things and just use one thing at a time, basically. You know, if you're trying to heat up water with a kettle, that's the only thing you should be having plugged into your power station. Unplug everything else. And another thing is too, if you're really worried about this, you know, if you're worried about this feature and you don't understand it, you can turn it off in the app. Usually, a lot of these companies, they have apps, like you just turn it off. So like EcoFlow, it's the X Boost feature. Bluetti, it's powerlifting. Anchor, it's SurgePad. GrowWatt, it's Watt Plus. And a lot of the kind of smaller brands, more off-brand companies that do have this feature, It's usually something similar to Blue Eddy, like powerlifting, power lift, power surge, something like that. If you can't find it and you don't know, or if there's just an unknown, the number one way to avoid this feature from engaging is just look at the specs of the power station. So on this Blue Eddy AC50B, it's a 700 watt inverter. So that means it can do 700 watts continuous at the proper voltage. And this feature won't kick in unless you try to exceed that, right? And we're not talking about, a temporary surge. We're talking about continuous output. So, you just check your appliance, make sure that it doesn't exceed whatever your inverter is rated for.